Anne Boleyn's rise to power in the English court was nothing short of spectacular. She went from being a lady-in-waiting to Queen of England, all in the span of a few years, captivating King Henry VIII and ultimately the entire nation. But Anne's ascent to the throne was not just about love, it was about ambition, political machinations, and a deadly struggle for power. And when it all came crashing down, the world watched in horror as Anne, once the beloved queen, was condemned to a fate no one could have imagined. In 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England, the second wife of King Henry VIII. Her marriage to Henry had been the catalyst for one of the most significant political shifts in European history, the English Reformation. Henry had famously broken from the Roman Catholic Church to marry Anne, after his divorce from Catherine of Aragon was denied by the Pope. Anne, with her sharp intelligence, her beauty, and her fierce will, had captured the king's heart and led him down a path that forever altered the course of English history. But being the second wife of a monarch who had already been married once and whose quest for a male heir was his obsession was a precarious position. Anne's ability to bear a male child, which was expected of her to secure the Tudor dynasty, became her singular purpose. Unfortunately for Anne, her first child, Elizabeth, was a girl. The king's disappointment was palpable. The pressure mounted as Anne, desperately trying to fulfill her role, suffered multiple miscarriages, and her relationship with Henry began to sour. Anne's fall from grace came swiftly and tragically. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, crimes that were highly dubious at best and likely fabricated by those who saw her as a threat. Among her accusers were her own courtiers, including powerful figures who sought to align themselves with the king. The charges were weak, and the trial was a sham, but it didn't matter. In a court where the king's desires held ultimate sway, Anne was found guilty. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to the Tower of London, the same tower that had witnessed the executions of so many before her. She was to be executed by beheading, a fate far less common than the gruesome hangings or burnings that awaited many who were executed for treason. Even in her final moments, Anne maintained her composure. She was reportedly calm, even dignified, as she made her way to the scaffold. Anne's final words were a quiet plea for mercy from God, but there was no forgiveness to be had from the monarchy she had once served. The executioner, an experienced French swordsman, delivered the fatal blow with one swift stroke. Anne Boleyn's life came to a tragic and abrupt end. She was just 35 years old. The once queen, who had been at the pinnacle of power and influence, was gone, her dreams of securing the Tudor dynasty shattered. Her daughter, Elizabeth, only 3 years old at the time, would be left without a mother and with a legacy that was now tainted by scandal. Anne Boleyn's execution shocked England, but the real tragedy lay in the innocent daughter left behind, Elizabeth I, the future queen who would go on to become one of England's most legendary monarchs. At the time of her mother's death, Elizabeth was just 3 years old, a fragile child in the hands of a kingdom torn by scandal. Her mother's disgrace and execution left Elizabeth vulnerable. In a world where political alliances and bloodlines were everything, being the daughter of a queen who had been executed for treason could have meant the end of her chances for the throne. But Elizabeth was no ordinary child, and her journey to power would be one of incredible resilience. For years after Anne's execution, Elizabeth was considered a bastard, marked by her mother's fall from grace. Henry VIII, having remarried and fathered several sons, seemed to have no further interest in his daughter. Elizabeth's early life was marked by political instability and personal insecurity, living under the shadow of her mother's tragic death and her father's volatile relationships. Her status as an illegitimate heir created constant threats to her life, especially as her half-siblings Edward VI, Mary I, and others were groomed for the throne. Despite the obstacles she faced, Elizabeth's intelligence, charm, and political acumen began to shine. Her education was rigorous, and she became fluent in several languages, learned history, philosophy, and diplomacy, and became a keen strategist. However, it was not just her intelligence that helped her survive the political Game of Thrones. It was her ability to outmaneuver those who sought to diminish her. Elizabeth knew the dangers of court life and how to protect herself from enemies who would see her crushed. Elizabeth spent years in the courts of her siblings, first under the rule of Edward VI, who was a Protestant, then under the reign of her sister Mary I, who was a devout Catholic. It was during her sister Mary's reign that Elizabeth faced the most peril. Mary, having endured the agony of being childless and seeing her own power questioned, feared Elizabeth's potential claim to the throne. Elizabeth was often imprisoned or under house arrest, her life threatened by political forces who sought to use her to strengthen their positions. But Elizabeth was patient. While her enemies plotted her downfall, she continued to grow stronger, both intellectually and politically. When Mary I died in 1558, Elizabeth was thrust onto the throne at the age of 25. It was a remarkable turn of fate, for Elizabeth had once been a symbol of weakness, a mere child of scandal and controversy. But now she was the Queen of England, the ruler of one of the most powerful nations in Europe. As queen, Elizabeth took up the mantle of avenging her mother's death. She knew the risks involved in undoing the damage her mother had suffered, but she also recognized the power that came with her crown. Elizabeth's reign would mark a break from the past, a defiance against the oppressive forces that had caused her mother's downfall. While she never openly condemned the actions that led to her mother's execution, Elizabeth subtly worked to restore Anne's reputation and secure her own legacy. Elizabeth I's reign, often called the Elizabethan era, would be marked by significant accomplishments. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the flourishing of the arts and literature, and the consolidation of Protestantism in England. Yet, for all her political triumphs, Elizabeth never forgot the personal pain her family had suffered. She was a woman who had learned to navigate the complexities of a patriarchal monarchy, and in doing so, she built one of the most formidable empires in history. Through Elizabeth's wisdom and resilience, Anne's legacy began to change. The daughter who had once been the symbol of her mother's tragic fate would now go on to become one of the most powerful women in history. Elizabeth's success was her revenge, not through bloodshed or violence, but through her ability to rise above the betrayals and injustices of the past. She showed the world that the daughter of a woman condemned to death for treason could not only survive but thrive. She could not undo the horrors of Anne Boleyn's execution, but she could ensure that her mother's memory lived on in the strength and wisdom of her own rule. Elizabeth I ruled for 45 years, and by the time of her death in 1603, she had solidified her place as one of the most revered monarchs in English history. Her reign brought stability, peace, and prosperity to a kingdom that had once been torn apart by religious and political strife. And in the quiet moments of reflection, Elizabeth must have realized that her greatest revenge against those who destroyed her mother lay not in vengeance, but in her remarkable triumph over adversity, proving that Anne Boleyn's legacy would never be erased.